Canberra Chess Club Club Championship 2023, Round 8, Chess Jitsu. This week I played against the leader of the pack, the former club champion, the favourite in the current tournament, and a player whose chess.com rating is well above 2100. This guy would have to be considered the equivalent of a brown belt in Jiu-Jitsu. During my preparation for this tournament, I googled this opponent, anticipating that I'd played him at some stage. I found his chess.com account and entered his username into openingtree.com, and there looked through his openings until I found a weakness in his repertoire. See, after e4, he almost exclusively plays c5, the Sicilian, and has apparently developed some expertise in the opening. However, after the specific line, knight f3, knight c6, and c3, his results were not so good, and the play is quite predictable. He consistently plays d5, and after e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, he plays bishop g4, and after bishop e2, he plays e6. So this was the position that I looked at most during my preparation. I noticed in this position that the computer's top suggestion was the immediate h3, but after the forcing line bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, the top computer line continues with queen d7, pawn takes pawn, queen takes queen check, king takes queen, losing the right to castle, and striking me as an odd way to play, not quite in keeping with my style and preferences. I also noticed that in that key position, c4 had been played against him with success. And in that game, he had played queen d8, allowing d5, and a basically nice, easy position for white, in which white is better and ended up winning. I figured that in this kind of position, I'd have good chances, if not to win, then to hold him to a draw. A feat I'd be quite pleased about. I also checked with the computer to see that after the two top computer suggestions, queen f5 and queen d7, the top move for white was still d5. Hence, I decided that this would be what I'd play if I ever had white and was paired with him. As it turned out, we did get paired, and I was white. I started with e4, and he, true to style, played c5, the Sicilian. I played knight f3, and on knight c6, I played c3 as planned, starting to enter into this line I knew him to be shaky with. He played d5, and after e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, he played, predictably, bishop g4, allowing bishop e2, and then e6, and boom, I was here. I was sitting across the table from the leader of the pack, in the key position that I had studied and prepared for in advance with the help from the computer, and with insider knowledge on previous games he'd played and lost from this point on. Trusting my preparation, I played c4, hoping he'd make the same mistake he'd made before and retreat his queen to d8, allowing d5, but also prepared to meet the computer's two top lines, queen f5 and queen d7, with the same d5 move. To my surprise, he played none of the above moves. He played queen h5. My heart started to hit a little harder in my chest, thinking I might just have a chance to beat this guy tonight. Whatever its merits, one thing I know for sure is that this move he's made is not the best. I thought about h3, attacking his bishop, but realised that due to the pin produced by the queen against the h3 pawn and the rook behind it, I would not actually be threatening to take the bishop. I thought about castling, which would protect my king and threaten h3 on the following move, although I also considered that he might be able to sacrifice the bishop for the h3 and ultimately then the g3 pawn as well. Not only that, but he could castle long and put more pressure on my d4 pawn. And things were, despite definitely not being objectively best for him, still very complex and hard for me to figure out. Of course, I also thought about d5, that move which would have been the answer to queen d8, queen f5 or queen d7. Yes, he could castle long, putting pressure on d5, but I could develop my knight to protect the pawn, and after that, in the time it takes him to put even more pressure on the pawn, I can castle, play h3, attack his bishop, and play on from there. Or so I thought. And thus, after a long while, I played d5. When I got home and checked with the computer, it reassured me that d5 was in fact the correct move here as well. So far, so good. But now, given that he played queen h5 and not queen d8, queen d7 or queen f5, we were in totally new territory, and I no longer had any special knowledge or preparation about this position. Now, we're just playing chess. He castled long, as I suspected that he would, protecting his king and immediately bringing his rook to a useful square, pressuring my d5 pawn, pinning it as well, so that pawn takes knight is not a possibility. Of course, I considered taking the knight and giving the queen up for the knight and rook, but in addition to the queen, he would also get my pawn on c6, so I decided against this move, and rightly so in hindsight. I opted instead for the very natural move knight c3, developing the knight and protecting my pawn and putting the move back in his hands. As it turns out, this was a mistake. He played knight f6, further attacking my d5 pawn, and here, again considering and rejecting the idea of sacrificing my queen and pawn for his knight and rook, I opted to play bishop g5, pinning his knight and thereby indirectly defending my d5 pawn. Without missing a beat, he played bishop takes knight, winning a piece and removing the defender of my bishop. I had of course anticipated this. I myself played bishop takes knight, equalizing the material count and taking aim at his rook. He played bishop takes bishop, winning a piece and hitting my queen, and I played queen takes bishop, winning his piece back and hitting his queen. And after we swapped queens, he took my bishop and I took his knight, and after all was said and done, he recaptured my pawn on c6. So when I looked around, I saw that I was down a pawn, but in exchange for it, I had somewhat destroyed his pawn structure. Now I can't say I was unhappy. Back when I'd played d5 and he castled long, the position was really very tricky. I felt as though I had emerged from the skirmish in an acceptable position. A position where, being down a pawn, I was not going to win, but having inflicted damage against his pawn structure, I may well have enough compensation to hang on and claim a draw. I was, however, worse. I played knight e4, essentially forcing him to defend with bishop e7, and then I solidified my position by playing b3. On rook d4, I retreated my knight, and on f5, I played rook ad1, attempting to swap rooks. My thought was that if all the pieces got traded, we might reach a position where, despite his extra pawn, the damaged pawn structure he has means that he can't make progress, and we might stagnate, repeat, and eventually draw. But he didn't want to trade rooks. He simply played rook h d8, doubling his rooks and putting the ball back in my court. Now, I can't play something like rook to d2 or to d3 because he'll simply capture that. I also can't move my d-rook away from the d-file because he would be able to play rook d2 check. So my rook on d1 is forced to stay where it is, and what else can I play? I could play something meaningless with my other rook, like rook h to e1, but that would allow him time to make slow progress. Slow but steady progress, whilst I simply languish with more meaningless rook moves. So I instead decided to force the trades I desired. I played rook takes rook, and after pawn takes rook, threatening my knight, I had of course foreseen that after rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, he would be attacking my knight, and I had planned to play it to a4, but only now that it was on the board, I realized that he was threatening to follow up with d3 check. So I opted for the more defensive posture, preparing to halt the advance of his pawn towards its promotion square, hoping I could keep it at bay, and hopefully thereby keep him to a draw. So I played knight b1, a square from which his position can never harass me. Here, he played as predicted d3 check, and wanting to keep my king advancing forward, given that we were in an endgame, but needing to stay off the dark squares to avoid bishop g5 check, which would then also further support his pawn advancing to d2, I played king f3. I knew he'd play e5 in response, and he did. And I could see now that he was not only going to hold on to his extra pawn, but he was going to protect it with his other pawn, and I would be relegated to a defensive task. And he would simply push himself toward me, on top of me, bit by bit, as slowly as he liked. And I would have no recourse of my own, no counterplay, just the hope to hold him off and keep myself from suffocating under the pressure of his weight by finding little air pockets to breathe through. I played h4, preventing his bishop from using the g5 square, but he just put his bishop on c5 instead, attacking from the other side and using the freedom that his pieces have and which mine lacked. From c5, his bishop put pressure on my f2 pawn, and he thus threatened to play e4 check, pushing my king away from the pawn, whereupon he would swoop in and take it. Anticipating this and trying to keep my air pockets open, I played rook f1, overprotecting the pawn, but allowing him to once again shuffle his weight slowly further on top of me. He played the move king d7, slowly as you like, marching his king towards the action. At a moment when my pieces were tied down and unable to be of any use in attacking his now centralizing king, I played king g3, trying to untie myself somehow. He played rook g8 check, and without any other good options I played king h3, hoping to play g3 and king g2, defending the f2 pawn again, and freeing up my rook from its duty defending the f2 pawn. Still hoping that despite his encroaching play, I may still somehow be able to claim that whilst you can certainly pin me down, you might not ultimately be able to find any way to squeeze the life completely out of me. He disagreed. He played e4, strengthening his central pawn mass and preparing it for further encroachment against my already essentially immobile, passive, and vulnerable position. I played g3, and after king e6 encroaching further still, I played king g2 as planned. Here he played f4, and I was starting to black out. Without a good alternative, I played knight d2, trying to bring the knight closer to the action. Maybe if he plays f3 check, I'll sacrifice my knight for 2 pawns, and once again claim that I'm holding on. But no, he didn't play f3 check. True to his style up until this point, he continued with a calm, collected move. A move that just encroached some more. No lashing out, no overstretch. Just weight and pressure sitting on me still. Not letting me move, not letting me breathe, and waiting for exhaustion and/or desperation to set in. He played f5, not doing much, but asking me what I should do in a position where there's nothing I can do. I played rook d1, biding my time. He played king e5, more stifling. His king could enter into my position via d4 now if it wants, and I can't do anything to counter it, and yet it is my move. So I played rook e1, biding my time again, maybe setting up knight f3 check, for what that's worth. Now, whilst there are many ways to win here, he opted for pawn takes pawn, and after I responded with pawn takes pawn, he played bishop b4, pinning my knight to my rook. I hence moved my rook out of the pin and defended my knight, but he traded the bishop for knight, and after I recaptured, he played f4. Once again, choosing, of all the different ways he could have chosen, the slowest, calmest, cruelest, suffocating way to win, putting more weight, more pressure on the g3 pawn. A pawn now attacked twice, unable to move, and unable to be defended for a second time. Seeing as, in addition to this unstoppable threat against my g3 pawn, he also already had an extra pawn in the position, which happens now to be a protected and passed pawn. He has a far more active king than mine. I realized here that my further fighting was futile. Sure, I could hold on until the very bitter end, but there's just simply no point. He's on my back and has me in a choke. I'm on my hands and knees, depending on my limbs to prop me up, and hence unable to use them to resist his choke. I'm already losing my breath and starting to black out, and if I try to fight further by bringing my arms up towards his in an effort to pull his away from my neck, my whole face and body will just collapse into the floor. Meanwhile, he'll just stay right on top of me. He will not let me go. And so in this position, I just reached up and tapped out. I stopped the clock, shook his hand, and thanked him for the game, and wondered where I had gone astray. In hindsight, c4 in this position is not the best move, although he'd lost before by playing queen d8 and allowing d5, and despite the fact that if he played queen d7 or queen f5, or as he played queen h5, d5 remained the best move, the fact is the position is very complicated, and I was not familiar with the ideas that followed. For instance, in this position, where during the game I played knight c3 defending the pawn, the correct move was in fact queen a4. And I did not play this or even think about it because I assumed that the queen had to remain in a position where it defended my d5 pawn. By playing queen a4, this pawn seems as though it can simply be captured twice. The issue for black is if he captures with the queen, he leaves the bishop undefended with check. And if he captures with the rook, then we develop the next knight with tempo against this rook. And when the rook, for example, moves away, we can then play h3. And if he trades, all of a sudden we are hitting this queen, and we're also threatening to take the knight, and when he takes back, take back with the queen. So the position here, in other words, becomes comfortable for white if in fact black takes this pawn. And therefore the best move for black here is in fact to move the knight, for instance here. And this allows a variety of trades, and again, a very complex position that remains best for white, or better for white. But point being, this is the way I would have had to play if I wanted to maintain my advantage after d5. And I simply was not prepared for that. My preparation was not that deep, and this kind of complex position is very difficult to handle in real life over the board. The other moment in this game that I think I could have actually improved was after the skirmish, where we settled on this position where he has the extra pawn and he has the damaged pawn structure. I played knight e4, and I think that was probably an unnecessary move and a waste of time. Yes, it attacks this pawn, but actually it helped him to develop his bishop. And after I played b3 and he played rook d4, I simply retreated my knight, kind of admitting that knight e4 was a waste of time in the first place. perhaps I could have played f3 here, but to me this was sort of a bit risky, and it really opened up all the dark squares around my king, and keeping in mind he's got a dark squared bishop, that wasn't necessarily something I wanted to do, especially since he can continue by forcing the knight away anyway, and now, even if I come here, his bishop is always going to get onto a nice diagonal. My knight's never really doing much, particularly after he's then going to double up his rooks. And it's just not really good anyway. In fact, in this position, as I've said in the video, I was just already worse. So although knight e4 maybe wasn't as good as the direct, offer of the rook trade, it was already kind of too late by this point. I was outplayed. Not only that, but at the end of the game, I had 2 minutes remaining on my clock, and my opponent still had 59 minutes left on his, reiterating that he didn't even break a sweat in his complete and utter deconstruction of my understanding of the game of chess. I hope to learn a lot from this experience, and was really impressed by how my opponent played. I really liked his style, and I hope to implement some of that slow and steady, encroaching style into my future games. If you've liked this video, like, share, subscribe, and comment, and come back next week for the final round, round 9 of the 2023 Canberra Chess Club Club Championship. Till then, take care of yourselves and others. Bye for now.